This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick.
From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 849, recorded on January 4th, 2022. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Western Massachusetts, Alan Dove.
Good to be here. It is 33 Fahrenheit, 1 Celsius. It's a clear, cold, calm wind day here in New England, which of the types of winter weather we get, this is not my least favorite.
What's your least favorite?
Sleet has got to be. Yeah, that's the worst.
Wintry mix?
Wintry mix, yeah. Freezing fog is pretty bad, too, which first time I ever saw that in a weather report, I said, oh, that doesn't, freezing fog, what the heck does that even mean? They're just making stuff up. And then I looked out the window, I said, oh, yeah, that's freezing fog. It really does happen.
Today, it's painful in New York to be outside. It's very cold, below freezing, and standing on the train is painful. It hurts. Also joining us from Austin, Texas, Rich Condit.
Hi, everybody. We got 66 degrees and sunny. We've had, not last night, but the 2 nights prior to that, freezing temperatures down in the 20s. We're looking at another freeze on Thursday. So this is pretty typical for this time of year. And it has turned my yard into, looked like a cooked spinach fight. So I have to spend a while cleaning that up, but that's all okay. It's part of the deal.
From Ann Arbor, Michigan, Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. I think my temperatures are identical to Alan's, at least according to one app. But because we have a wind advisory, it feels like 22 Fahrenheit and a lot colder Celsius than.
And from Madison, New Jersey, Brianne Barker.
Hi, everyone. It turns out that my weather is also pretty much the same as Alan's. I'd rather it were the same as Rich's. But it's a little cold, but that's okay. Good day to be inside.
So I introduced everyone in the order in which they joined TWiV.
Yes.
Sometimes I do it randomly and mix it up. But today it was Alan came after Dixon, and then Rich, and then Kathy, and then Brianne. And so here we are at the beginning of a new year. And I don't know. I was just thinking, I don't know when we started talking about the weather. I don't think Dixon and I actually did that. I'm not sure we did it when Alan joined either. I have no idea.
Remember, it's certainly, well, I mean, you and Dixon were in the same place, so it didn't really make sense to introduce with that. Yes. How's the weather over there, Dixon? But then, I added a little geographic diversity, and then Rich came in, and probably around that time we started doing that.
Yeah, I was, when I joined in, I was in Florida. So that was quite geographically diverse. So
for the longest time, Dixon would come to my office and record in person. It was only in the beginning of the pandemic that he started doing it on Zoom, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe a few episodes here and there, but that recording studio is now dismantled pretty much in my office. All the mics are gone, the recording equipment. I've left some bare bones things so Amy can use it because it's better sound quality than being in the lab. But most of it's moved out. Someone, our departmental admin, he came in, he looked at me, he said, "No more TWiV here." I said, "Nope, that's it. Moving on."
TWiV has gone downtown.
Move on. What is it? Move along. Nothing to see here.
Nothing to see here.
Yeah, we're downtown, which is really amazing, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is our first recorded episode of 2022, and it has become a tradition. I was thinking yesterday, when does something become a tradition? When you do it how many times? We've been doing it for quite a while. To sum up the previous year from a virology perspective. And so that's what we're going to do for you today. And in many respects, this actually requires more preparation than a normal episode where you just have to read a couple of papers and rely on your knowledge to fill in the gaps.
Well, and now that we're doing like 500 episodes a year, it requires even more. And when you had the question about that we're going to get to later on favorite show title, it's like, oh gosh, okay, I'll scroll through. Okay, next page, scroll through.
Yeah, on my browser there were 15 pages of TWiV.
Mine too.
And I thought, I wish I could. If you can actually just display the titles, but it doesn't always tell you what's in each episode.
Right.
So, yeah, I did a lot of that yesterday. Actually, we had 146 episodes released. Okay, not necessarily recorded. So, for example, the last episode we recorded in 2021, we released the first. So that counts for the next year's episode. So 146 episodes, 701 through 846. And that includes, I think, 52 clinical updates with Daniel. I figured there was one a week. I just made that number up. I didn't actually count them.
You didn't want to go in and count them manually. Yeah.
No, because you start counting, then you forget where you are when you go to the next page. That's
you
the
need
most
one of
ever.
those clickers like the hematologists use.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And in fact, last year's was the most episodes ever and this year surpassed it because we're essentially doing 3 a week for most weeks, and that will change.
TWiV is growing like case counts.
I don't know when it will change, but we have plans to spin Daniel's into its own entity at some point. We have an idea for an infectious disease twice a month show with Daniel and perhaps someone else. But I'm not sure when that's going to happen because obviously we still have a lot of focus on COVID. And for us, I don't know how long we'll keep doing 2 a week. As long as there's a need to look at COVID data, I suspect it won't go beyond this year, though. I have a feeling that, the data are going to keep coming out for years, but it's not going to be pressing, right? I don't know. What do you guys think? You have any thoughts about that?
I think it's going to reach a point where there's just not much more to say on a lot of these subjects. Yes, there'll be new information coming out for lifetimes to come, but how much more are we going to have to say about waves of infection and vaccination and variants and all this stuff? And just we're gonna taper that off, I think, probably this year.
Can we all make sure to knock on wood, though, as we say?
Yes, right.
Yeah,
unless another pandemic comes along.
I'm sitting here thinking, when's this going to be over?
Right.
An arc that I wound up swapping out was how often we've been either wrong or surprised or whatever. And I clearly recall conversations back around, I don't know, July or something like that, when we were saying, well, yeah, there might be another surge, but it'll be nothing like what we've seen before. And so, I would like to say, okay, this one's it. This is it, but it's full of surprises.
I
Yeah.
think as long as you can tell by the questions that people have, right? When they start to fizzle out and there are no more questions about how does this work or what does this do, then it's relegated to the paper, the interesting paper that comes out now and then that starts to explain some of what we have seen, and that'll be mixed in with all other virology. So I suspect at that point we need just 1 a week.
Yeah.
And you may say, well, what do you have that studio for? I'll do some other things. We'll find out.
Oh, well, if you go to the Microbe TV page, you see that this is not a lone podcast.
Yeah. I do have, besides Daniel doing his own thing, so his clinical weekly update will be morphed into a different program. We've already talked about that for some time. But I also have ideas for other shows with other people. So
and there's TWiP and TWIM
and yes,
et cetera, et cetera.
Of course, they're all riding on the TWiV coattails, right? Someone said, put up TWIM as a video, even though there's no video. Just put the audio up because a lot of people just listen. So, if I'd done that 2 years ago, the TWIM would get 50 views. And now it's getting over 3,000 views because it's riding, which is great, right?
So what's the listenership for TWiV now? Do you have any idea?
So, we have audio and video, what do you call them? Forks, right?
Streams or whatever. Yeah, not streams.
Well, in programming, you fork a program at some, right? So the audio consistently, when I drop an episode, you get 30 to 40,000 downloads that day. And then it moves up 60, 70, 80,000, right? And then the video, I mean, they're slowly inching up. We have 105,000 subscribers at the moment, which is fabulous. But, you know, the TWiVs, Daniel's get 20,000 views, but then that keeps going. TWiVs get 10 to 20,000 depending on the episode.
So you're talking in the range of 100,000.
I think there are 100,000 people mixed up listening to us. Not mixed up people.
If they're listening to us, they may be mixed up.
All mixed together. Yes, which I think is a good number, and I think it will just grow going forward because people have found us. And
well, it certainly justifies the effort, and you know, the emails that we get that express gratitude for the show, you know, one or two of those justifies the effort.
Yes,
and there are more than one or two of those.
Oh, and there are plenty of emails, similar ones that don't get read, that are amazing, that just say, you know, I couldn't do this without you. I mean, the other day I put up a picture on Instagram and, you know, I said, Happy New Year, everyone. It got more responses than in any other picture I've put up, right? And I put up a lot of pictures of the studio and so forth, you know, a few hundred views. This thing got almost 1,000 views. People just say, thank you. Most of them are saying, thank you for doing all this. And I think there are a lot of people out there that are very grateful, but don't express it. So I have never felt that we're doing something futile, for sure.
Well, and I'm grateful to them for listening because it allows me to keep checking into this. You know, it provides an excuse for me to keep checking into this and chatting with you all every week, which is awesome.
Actually,
I think we have said this several times that it's our little community here that we get together, right? And we enjoy chatting with each other, for sure. Yeah.
One of the communications we get occasionally is from, that we get occasionally is from people who say that our reach goes beyond just the listeners.
Right? Yeah, it's true.
Because they are in contact with people who's, you know, who learn indirectly from us. And in fact, in that line, I forget when this was, but I had a conversation or an email or something recently with somebody who said that because of knowledge that they had gained from the show and because of spreading the show to others, they've actually gotten numerous people in their workplace vaccinated.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Nice.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Very good.
And I mean, there's also how much this matters to us. I mean, I get a lot out of listening to our conversations and being a part of them
absolutely.
and all of that. You know, this is invaluable to me in about a million ways.
I use it for teaching all the time. And every time we update the textbook, I just look back on TWiV to see what was new and needs to be added. That's all I have to do.
I routinely, I'll get a story assignment on something, anything virology related, and I'll think, oh, gee, who should I call about this? Oh, wait, we had somebody on TWiV, so it's just vastly expanded my network of sources.
Now, this year we had a lot of guests. The past year, 2021, 53 guests, and I would like to read them because we really appreciate them. Our very first of last year, Emily Travanti, and I'll come back to her episode. Then Gisa, Gerald, Stephanie Becker, Cesar Munoz, Fontela, Jason McClellan, Paul Benash, Theodora Hatsuano, Paul Offit, Ginger Campbell, Eva Harris, Janet Smith, Janet Iwasa, Matt Freeman, Forrest Rower, Maria Isabel Rojas, Susan Weiss, Alessandro Sette, John Dennehy, Davida Smith, Monica Trujillo, Arturo Casadeval, Nadine Lamberski, Peter Dashak, Thea Colson Fisher, Marion Koopmans, Robert Gary, David Feigenbaum, Lori Garrett, Christian Anderson, Ron Fouché, Joseph Heiser, Mariah Spara, Kieran Thacker, Jeff Shaman, Shane Crotty, Maya Breitbart, Chadi Saad Roy, Carolyn Wagner, Sarah Gilbert, Florian Kramer, Fausto Baldanti, Thea Fisher, oh, I had her twice, Catherine Moore, Moshe Arditi, Ivet Bahar, David Tuller, Greg Zuckerman, Teresa Bautista, Isabel Francisco, Jesus Gonzalez, Joel Gonzalez, and Christine Marizzi.
And those are all co-first authors.
That's right. So almost basically one a week if you average it out, right?
Yeah.
But we thank them for coming on, and we'll have more this year for sure. It's easier to get guests because people know what we're doing, right? It's now visible. It's, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm happy to do that. And I was looking through the episodes, and I realized we did actually do quite a few non-COVID episodes last year, right?
Yeah. So when you were talking about using it for teaching, we're working on updating the choices of TWiVs that students can listen to and write a paper on. They have several different options, and some of them choose to do the TWiV option. And so I picked almost all non-SARS-CoV-2 TWiVs, and there were a lot more than the 4 that you have listed here, and which we had at least one paper.
So we'll continue to do that as well.
Yes.
More virology.
I have to say that the last couple of years, in my mind, gets really mashed together.
Yes.
Because as I look at this list, I think, wasn't Shane on twice?
Yeah, and I was
wasn't
looking at
Shaman on twice, and where is Ralph Barrick?
And where's Tony Fauci? And but no, that was 2020. I think this is a collective problem that billions of people are now having, that we can't distinguish the past 2 years from each other.
Yeah, there's a compartment that is pandemic.
Yes. In fact, before everyone else came on, Vincent and I were talking about what year of the pandemic this was. And it was sort of like, well, this is the 3rd, but it did start in 2019. Nobody knew about it. So does 2019 so it's been a few years, and they're all just kind of mushed together at this point.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. Where's this such and such a guest? But it was the previous year. So in 2020, we had a lot of great guests also. So we've had more in recent years than ever. And I like that. I think it's good for us, and it's good for them. They get visible, and I think that's important. And they get to talk for an hour.
Our guest episodes are consistently some of the best.
And they get to talk for an hour, right? Instead of being interviewed for an hour, and then they use a few minutes of what you say. So
I get to ask them all these questions.
Yeah,
of course.
That's great.
That's where I get to learn things.
Yeah.
I mean, not that I don't learn things from you guys too, but
no, of course. But in the end, TWiV is still people getting in the field, getting together to talk about science, and you can tell by listening to us, because we'll tell you what's in the paper, but then we start talking about it as we would if we're sitting around having lunch or something. And that's what I thought it should be originally, and it's really consistently. And even with our guests, we chat.
It's a great format.
Right?
Yeah.
I really like the format, and I think you can learn a lot from listening to people have a conversation, which was an idea, but it turns out to work. I think it's very valuable. Unfortunately, we lost some virologists last year, as we always do, and I came up with some. Mavis Abandi McKenna, of course, who was on a TWiV previously, Pernell Chopin, Hans-Dieter Klenk, William Wold, and Randy Kors. And I don't know if there are others. There might be. But we mentioned some of those in the year.
Yeah.
And, of course, in 2021, Daniel and I signed a lease on this space, a studio office, which we call the incubator, in the vein of Andy Warhol's The Factory, right? Which was somewhere around here. And I think I started to put things here, I don't know, in the summer-ish, spring, summer, I don't remember. It is now fully functional, although not in its final iteration. There's still some things that have to be done.
It's kind of like the Death Star in the second Star Wars movie. It's not quite fully built, but it's fully functional.
I mean, one of the things that'll change is right now I'm here. There's no one else here usually. And that should change at some point with not just guests. I mean, I hope to bring people here as we are able to and have them participate, but also have people helping out. And as we became a 501c3 in 2021, we can raise substantial amounts of money to hire people and get some help here. Because it's my vision that this continue as long as it can, beyond me, for sure, maybe all of us. and I'd like to see if I can get that vision to be fulfilled. So I'm spending more and more time here. I come here every day. I'd go to Columbia twice a week now, and I really enjoy it because I walk 2 blocks from the train station, and I come and I do what I want to do, and I'm having a great time.
That's awesome.
I really like it. I wish
That's
that
so
more.
cool.
I wish more of you could participate. But
By the way, is the train crowded and is everybody masked?
everyone is required to be masked, and the conductors are very good at telling people. And but yes, everyone is masked. No, it's not crowded at all. I never have a problem getting a seat. In the old days, it would be tough to find a seat. I mean, there are rows of 3 seats and 2, right? And nobody wants anyone next to them, so they put their stuff.
Yeah.
But nowadays, it's never a problem. Yeah, I don't know how they survive. Of course, it's state supported, I suppose, because there are a lot of trains and they're empty. So are the subways. The subways are pretty empty as well. So
Are the conductors good at reminding people that their nose is connected to the rest of their respiratory
Yes.
system?
yeah, totally. Not so much on the subway because nobody. On the subway, the conductor tells you which station you're at, right? But they never. But
That's right. They've got automated voices now. You can actually understand them.
Actually, the subways that I go on, they're not automated.
they're not automated,
There's still
okay.
people who either speak clearly or they don't, and
Yeah.
it's frustrating. But the conductors on the train, before the train leaves, where you cover your mouth and nose with your mask. It's required. Doesn't matter if you're vaccinated. It is a federal law. If you don't wear a mask, you're breaking the federal law. And so people wear masks, even though they don't want to.
Right.
People grumble. But and there's no eating or drinking as a consequence. Anyway, I'm enjoying this very much, and I hope to do this for many years.
Good.
Excellent. As soon as we're done today, I'll send you some dates when I can come by.
Hey,
on the
come by,
train.
please do. There's plenty of room here, and it's fun. We're doing a TWiP here next week, I believe. I think everyone is supposed to come. We have a guest coming. Anyway, there's a surprise on the wall behind me. Something was installed today, and I will reveal it more fully maybe next week. But I'm very excited about it, and it has to do with the subject matter of the incubator.
Ah.
Okay, so we'll come back to some more reminiscences, I suppose. But let's talk. One of the things we do on these first of the year episodes is for each of us to talk about we used to do an episode that we liked, and it's slowly morphed into
Just an arc
theme.
that we liked, yeah.
Or an arc. So stories, arcs, actually whatever we want to talk about. We'll alternate to give as Kathy said once, to change our voices. So
Yes.
So it's break up the voice. So let me go first. We each have 2 because nicely, we always had 10-ish arcs and there are 5 of us, so that works perfectly. I think, of course, possibly the biggest topic of most of the episodes or epitopes that we did was the vaccines, right? I think that permeated because they really began to be rolled out at the beginning of 2021 in large numbers, at least in the U.S., and we are U.S.-centric here. But we had a lot of TWiVs about them, and I think some of the important themes included this realization that the vaccines do not prevent infection; they prevent disease. And of course, as we got 6 months after the original vaccination, then antibody levels contracted. Most people use a different word, but I like contracted. And
That
then
is the correct immunological term.
and yes, and Brianne and I discussed that at one point. And you get infected, as you do with many human viral vaccines, but you're protected against a severe disease. I mean, right now, there are many, many infections happening daily in the U.S., but most of them they're either in unvaccinated people or they're quite mild in vaccinated people. And I look at this as an arc because I think people were surprised about this. They thought, these are supposed to prevent infection, and they don't. And
Well, I'm gonna have a little spiel about that as well in my arc.
Sure.
Yeah.
many of our
Mine's sort of related too.
Yeah.
many
Because the goalposts moved, Right.
Of course. And Paul Offit summarized it beautifully, right?
Yeah.
He said some people move the goalposts, I don't know who actually does this. I'm not sure who's in charge.
It's a collective thing that you can't blame on any individual, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right, which is good. But I think he summarized it beautifully, yeah.
To me, the peak of this arc is Paul Offit's thing about vaccines being like the fire extinguisher in your kitchen. I've used that dozens of times.
Yeah.
The vaccines don't prevent fires;
Right.
they put them out.
Yeah.
And that's just a beautiful metaphor that anybody can get.
So he was on twice last year, right? So that was his first visit, right? He used that metaphor.
Who knows? Yes, I think it was his first.
So we talked about this idea of contraction of antibody levels, which still permeates the narrative, I think, in an unfair way, because then we got to the booster issue where we said, okay, at some point somehow it was let's get all boosted so that we can raise the antibody levels back up and prevent infection, even though, as Paul said, that's not what the vaccines were designed to do. And then what are you going to do in 6 to 8 months when they go back down again? So we're not there yet. We see some countries already doing fourth doses and so forth. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more this year. And we did cover some other vaccines. So of course, we covered the mRNA vaccines. We covered the Janssen J&J. We covered CoronaVac in TWiV 708, the Pfizer in TWiV 715, Sputnik in 718. And so I think, as it should be, that's a main topic, right? Because a main arc, because that's what, as Daniel said, that's how we're going to get out of this pandemic, largely by vaccination. And we should be very grateful that we have so many that work so well, right? 90+% effectiveness against severe disease. That's amazing. That's really amazing.
As a matter of fact, that tickles again my arc of things we got wrong or things that were surprises, because I think very early on when people were saying we're going to have a vaccine in a year, we all went, nonsense. No. At least I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And so I don't want to call it a miracle because it's not. A lot of people worked really hard on this for a very long time, but it is, Alan, you're the words guy. Okay. There must be a word for this. It is amazing.
It is scientical?
Scientical. I like that.
He's right.
It is a dramatic demonstration of what one can accomplish by throwing Department of Defense size quantities of money at a public health problem.
That's it, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, the technology is important, but we have
never spent this kind of money on a public health thing that's on a scale of what we spend on guns and bombs. And if you make that kind of funding available, you can accelerate things, not by shortcuts, but as Tony Fauci explained, by just absorbing all the financial risk. And there was massive financial risk behind this. And Pfizer went it alone, but that's because Pfizer's richer than God. So they were able to throw billions of dollars into a project that could fail. Because really they needed the good PR, and it worked out great. Moderna couldn't do that, so the government picked up the tab, and this was all done at risk of vast sums of money that were worth it, and would have been worth it even if it hadn't worked out.
And other countries did the same, right?
Yeah,
not just us.
Yeah. I mean, the Chinese government was on this immediately, and of course they have the ability to just have one person say, we will spend this on that, and it happens, which is not necessarily a good thing, but in this case it led to a certain amount of speed.
We're also fortunate that a vaccine to spike alone works as well as it does, because that doesn't have to be.
No, it turns out in hindsight that this virus is really easy to develop vaccines against if you score it against other things we've tried to develop vaccines against. This is not HIV. this is a soft target as far as vaccines go.
Back to the things that we got wrong. Early on, we talked about, is spike alone okay? Shouldn't we be using other antigens? I had an opportunity to interact with Bernie Moss the other day, who has been busy during a pandemic making Vaccinia-based or MVA-based vaccines, and his is spike based. And I asked him, you got room in Vaccinia for other antigens. Why not others? He said, well, how would I be able to tell if that improved the vaccine? Because spike alone is so good.
Yeah.
It's a good point. But this reliance on spike, it worked, but we actually don't know why it worked, because the assumption is it's neutralizing antibodies, but nobody's looked at other things, right? And it brings back that respiratory syncytial virus paper that we did not too long ago, where, correlates of protection, at least in non-human primates, don't always go with neutralizing antibodies. So I think we got fortunate to a certain extent that something went along with neutralizing antibodies. It may be, I mean, it could be wrong. It could be neutralizing antibodies, but it seems to me that the high protection against disease is indicating something else, maybe T cells or something else.
And we're lucky that this didn't turn out to be like flu. If this was a flu pandemic, we've been working on flu vaccines for close to a century now, and they're as good as we can get them, and they're not that great.
Yes, indeed.
So,
yeah, it could have had 60% effectiveness, right?
Yeah, the bar was set at 50% prevention of severe disease.
Yeah. It just reminds me of the polio vaccine when, the Salk vaccine was first trialed, and was 50-some% efficacy against polio, and that was licensed, right? Yeah. It's good enough. Anyway, so I think vaccines were a big part of our epitopes last year, and that kind of summarizes some of the different aspects of it, and we'll certainly be talking about them more as we go forward. All right, so it looks like Kathy's next.
Yeah, so mine is a contrast to that. I wanted to pick non-coronavirus papers. The ones that I looked at, the episodes that I included as potentials for our class, there's at least 12 of them. So there's a lot more than 12 non-coronavirus papers that we discussed. And I couldn't pick all of them, but I tend to like the ones that give us new mechanisms about how viruses do what they do. I've always liked those over the years. They seem just the most virological. And so, for instance, the one that was 763 entitled Cap Snatch Fever, which was talking about how cap snatching, which is how RNA viral messenger RNA synthesis is primed with fragments from the host, some interesting findings that can lead to synthesis of novel viral proteins from some of that host component. And so I thought that was interesting. 784 was virtually live from ASV, and in particular, the guest from that episode whose work I found fascinating was Mariah Sparra, where she's looking at genetic variation in herpes simplex virus. And as a DNA virus, we tend to think that, they don't have that much variation, especially when you compare it to RNA viruses. And I think her work really points out that that's maybe a misunderstanding on our part. 819 was how to stall a copy machine. And so this one is kind of a coronavirus paper, but it's about how remdesivir works. And, I could just remember seeing the movie of, how the RNA copying is going along, and then there's this crash or clash. And I just really found that cool. The 822 episode, Viking Variola variants, that was all about the history of the smallpox virus and things that did or didn't relate to the history of the what caused smallpox. I thought was really fascinating.
That was a cool paper. Yeah.
That was.
Yeah. And I guess we're going to get another episode sometime about more variola or vaccinia or something, right, Rich?
Sometime. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And then we recently did one on codon optimization 847, and 740 also was an episode where we did codon optimization. The 740 was polio and RSV, and 847, I've just drawn a blank. What virus that was about.
Was it
Lassa?
Lassa?
That was Lassa.
Lassa.
Yes, thank
That's
you.
right.
I lost it. Okay. So to me, those are pretty cool episodes. So just some non-coronavirus stuff in there.
So I had forgotten that we'd done the other codon de-optimization paper, but that was cool because they showed you could rescue the codon de-optimized RSV by recombination, right? Because we talk about how it can't revert because there are too many changes, but it can recombine, and that was quite cool. And the remdesivir paper was so beautiful because the biochemical data said after incorporation, the polymerase adds a few bases and then it stops. And then they had the structure which showed why the clash. It was just perfect melding of the two. That was good, which you couldn't do, 10 years ago.
I totally agree. Of those episodes, the remdesivir mechanism, I think, was my favorite. And going beyond what you just said, Vincent, they also showed that you could change the residue that caused the clash and remove the clash and get some resistance. I mean, it was amazing. Just amazing stuff.
Yeah, talk about a good paper for teaching.
Yes.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the cap snatch fever, was that a John Udell paper?
I have it right here. It's, yes, Udell is third author from the end.
Okay.
Adolfo Garcia Sastry is fourth author from the end. Then Hutchinson and Marazzi.
Got it. Well, John will be back this month, so can ask him that's very cool. Very cool stuff. So I just like, the other episodes are non-COVID are great.
I like that we're getting back to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will always try and have at least one a week. Alan, what do you have for us?
So what I have, one of the things that stood out to me by the time I got to the Google Doc, a lot of the things I thought of for the year had already been grabbed, but the kind of arcs that really drew a lot of my attention this year were the vaccine and antiviral demand, supply, and perception roller coaster, which is all interlinked. It's hard to remember, decades ago at the beginning of 2021, how we were all anxious to finally be able to get the vaccine. But the supply was short because it takes a while to ramp up production when you suddenly need 1 billion doses of something that was just cleared. And while a lot of that was ramped up faster than it normally would be because of these huge investments, there was still just fundamental limits. And so the beginning of the year, it was very, very hard to get on the short list of people who were qualified to get vaccinated. And I remember we were all excited when each of us got, I got my shot, and that was also a period of tremendous optimism, I think, public optimism about the vaccine, about, things finally turning around in a lot of respects. And then when that initial demand was finally met, and the supply ramped up, and the hope was, okay, now we can get the other, the whole, get 80%, 90% of the vaccinations of the population vaccinated. And in the US, of course, that stalled out, not because of supply problems, but because of people, which, I don't know, maybe in retrospect, we could have seen coming from the toxicity of the preceding several years, but Now we're awash in vaccine, and there was the whole discussion about booster doses, which was basically let's super vaccinate the willing because we still have all these unvaccinated people, and maybe we can slow down the clogging of the ICUs by just getting the ones we can vaccinate super immune and limiting spread. But of course, here we are with Omicron and just the holiday reopenings and vast numbers of cases. And so the vaccine is kind of a good news followed by bad news type of story. The vaccines are great if people would actually use them. And then, at the same time, there's the international perspective where a lot of countries still don't have enough vaccine, and that hasn't been fixed. So this whole thing over the course of the year, and then hopefully in 2022, a lot of those wrinkles are going to start to get straightened out. We also, with vaccines, we saw the goalposts move, as I mentioned earlier. So the initial approvals and the whole focus initially with these vaccines was prevent severe disease and death, and they do an outstanding job of that. And we now know that they still do an outstanding job of that in a variant that's got a gazillion mutations in the main antigen for the vaccine. But then when it was discovered that they also reduce infection, oh, well, that's the new goal now. So if the vaccine doesn't prevent an infection, we're going to call that a breakthrough case. And I think we've all railed about that quite a lot to no avail. And I guess that's going to persist. And that was some of the logic behind the booster doses, was to try and limit spread by, vaccinating people with a vaccine that was never designed to limit spread. And then the other kind of thing in the background through all this has been the antiviral story, which very early in the pandemic was the thought of, oh, well, maybe there are some compounds we can throw at this before we have a vaccine and we can save these people's lives. And of course, that started off with spotty information that turned into misinformation about hydroxychloroquine and then ivermectin, which don't work, in case anybody was wondering. And then we got to remdesivir, which kind of works if you use it at the right time, but you're probably not going to use it at the right time because you've got to show up to the hospital before you're going to be using it. And Daniel has talked extensively about that. And by the time people are at that phase, they're past the point where the virus really matters and the immune system is what you need to deal with. And we don't have good drugs for dealing with that. And then finally, toward the end of 2021, we got some actual successes. So we now have Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, and they're pills, and you can give them to people when they test positive, and they're not necessarily going to stop the pandemic in its tracks, but it's a tool we certainly wish we'd had 12 months ago.
So, Alan, I'm looking at the global vaccination situation. Nice map at the Times. You could mouse over every country and see. And, the 60% of the world have gotten one dose of vaccine, and less is fully dosed. But there are big disparities. In particular, Africa is just full of countries that are less than 20%. They're all, some of them are in the single digits. And what's the problem there?
It is not the same as the problem in the US at all.
No.
It is not a demand. It is not a demand issue. It's a supply issue. And if you take an industrialized, developed country like South Africa, they have just issues getting the supply into the country, which of course became more complicated when we banned air crews from coming back from there. And I'm gonna riff on that on my next arc. But then you've got many other countries in Africa throughout the continent that are still dealing with the lingering effects of colonialism, of course, and either have unstable governments or no money or, all the endemic problems that plague the region in the wake of colonialism and have done so for decades, and we've done so little to fix, even though we bear much of the responsibility for them. And when I say we, I mean the U.S. and Europe primarily.
Yeah, I think the financial issue is pretty big for a lot of those countries in Africa in terms of, are they able to afford vaccine, and is their vaccine available for them to buy?
Yes. Yeah, and the U.S., of course, having enough to give like 10 doses to every American was not helping matters. And early on, I even had a little riff about this where, okay, we have the worst healthcare system in the developed world. We pay more for less care than anybody else. If the one thing we get is first shot at the vaccine when there's a once in a lifetime pandemic, just give us that. And that was fine for the first few months of the vaccine rollout. But once it was clear that we had enough for all of our people, I think we were slow to distribute it elsewhere. There are also some really fundamental logistical issues, which has been exacerbated by the everything shortage, right? I mean, we've all had this experience where we go to the supermarket and, okay, why do you have no olives? It didn't hit the olive crop. What's going on here? Well, it's because we don't have people to drive the trucks to ship the olives to the store. And so just random things are hard to move around. And then you take that type of a problem globally and to places like, I don't know, to pick a country that we've actually talked about a fair amount on past episodes of TWiV, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right, where they had the big Ebola outbreak. Why do they have a hard time? Well, the logistics of a place like that and the poverty and the misrule post-colonialism, situation and the whole setting, and then you just don't have the infrastructure, and then the infrastructure that's available gets tanked by the pandemic as well. It's just a lot.
The DRC, 0.1% fully vaccinated. And then right next to it, Rwanda, 43% fully vaccinated.
Huge disparities. Yeah.
Amazing. Some of the higher numbers, now the U.S. is not. 60, we seem to be stuck around 62%. Yeah. Canada is at 78%. Australia is at 78%. This is fully. China is at 86% fully vaccinated. It's quite impressive. Yeah. And some, I think New Zealand is, 78%.
Portugal's way up there, aren't they?
Portugal is at 89%. Yeah. Spain is 81%. France is 74%. I'm surprised that Sweden and Norway and Finland, the countries that are kind of models for vaccination programs, they're just in the 70s. I think it would be higher. Anyway, yes, I think this is very disturbing that when you look at this world map, there's some dark colors and then there's a lot of light ones. It's just unfortunate.
Thinking about supply and demand issues, this reaches back to the beginning of the pandemic, but it makes me think that early on I made my own masks because you couldn't get masks.
Yeah.
Then now, after really having rapid tests all over the place on the shelves, you can't get those anymore.
Yeah.
And then don't forget toilet paper.
Yes. That's a 2020 problem.
So something that Alan said brought up another thing for me, which is the inability to somehow catalog and keep straight such that I can find it again, all the information that I've read or heard or seen. And what Alan said in particular that made me think about that, and I went off looking for it to no avail, that is the term breakthrough infection. Mm-hmm. I read a paper at some point in the last year after the vaccines came out that had been written in 2018 or so that described what happens when you have a vaccine and someone who has been vaccinated gets infected. And they said the term for this is a breakthrough infection. And so while some of you may rail against the term, I don't know that there's really any better term.
Yes.
I understand the problem of, well, the vaccine was never supposed to keep you from ever getting infected. But when you get an infection after you've been immunized, supposedly the term, at least in this paper that I read, is breakthrough infection.
I believe you that is the correct term. The problem I have with it is that it has come to mean vaccine failure, which it is not.
And I'm sure you can find other papers that just call it infection. That's the problem with the scientific literature, right? So.
But I think it's a good point that was in 2018 a perfectly legitimate term to use in that context. And I think my problem with it is the negative connotation that it has gained in the course of the pandemic, and that has been used as ammunition for people who want to refuse vaccination. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. The vaccine fails anyway. No, the vaccine is not failing. If you tested positive and you're still alive, that's because the vaccine is working.
I also think that we have far better capacity now to test people than we ever did for any other vaccine, right?
I think that has been a point that I've wanted to make so many times in so many places over the past year, that if we were testing as frequently for flu after flu shots with PCR, or if we were testing as frequently for anything else with PCRs after vaccination, we might find that this is not so odd.
And in fact, I sat through a seminar by Michael Osterholm a number of years ago at a flu, the National Influenza Immunization Summit, which is an annual event. And he presented a meta-analysis in which he was looking at efficacy of flu vaccine. And he got 7 kinds of lightning from the audience about having limited his meta-analysis to papers that looked at PCR positive cases and measured those as vaccine failures. And just everybody in this group was on about, no, you can't do it that way because the flu vaccine is preventing these bad outcomes, and you need to look at the papers that look at outcomes. And of course, being Mike Osterholm, he didn't back down at all. But it was very telling to me at the time that this is the proper measure of a vaccine is, what are you preventing?
Rich, what do you have for us?
So this reaches back into 2020 as well, and this is probably my favorite arc, and that is the virus. I don't even know what tense to use. Will become, is becoming, has become endemic. Okay, and
the virus is fated to endemicity.
Early in this whole thing, back in like March or April of 2020, when Ralph Baric was first on, he talked about how it's quite possible that this virus is no more lethal than one of the existing cold coronaviruses, except that it's being introduced into a naive population where the older people are and others are more susceptible to serious disease. And once we reach a certain level of immunity, there's going to be waning immunity, maybe a little antigenic variation, and the virus is going to be here in the environment all the time, get infected when you're a kid, and establish some immunity, get reinfected throughout your life, okay, as your immunity wanes or the virus changes a little bit, and it will become endemic. And I think there's been a lot of resistance to this idea, or maybe misunderstanding. Okay, my sense is that people have thought, "Oh, we're going to get rid of it." All right, and I think this is just such an important concept because for the last several months I've been harping on this thing when people talk about vaccination, and you guys as well have said it's not. You're not comparing getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated. You're comparing getting vaccinated or getting COVID, because you're going to get it. eventually. All right. And that's what endemic is all about. Over time, if we live long enough, I think all of us will probably get some flavor of this, vaccinated or not. It's just what actually is the outcome. And with this in mind, watching this happen had been fascinating, especially in the current context. Okay. We have a huge number of cases going on now, and not the same proportional rise in hospitalizations or deaths. And this is a characteristic, I think, of this thing becoming endemic. And it's fascinating.
I was just looking at the Massachusetts data today, and the latest spike, post-holiday, winter, Omicron, all this coming together, dwarfs. It's the case counts are above what we had at any point. The positivity rate has gone up to like 20%, which we haven't seen since the very beginning of the pandemic when there weren't enough tests. And that's because the official tests are missing huge numbers of positive cases out there, and people are often doing a home test or they're not testing because they've got mild illness because they were vaccinated. And it's just, that has shot up through the roof. Hospitalizations are still, hundreds of units down from where they were at the peak of last winter's wave. So I'm comparing date to date. And if you look at January 4th, 7-day average from 2021, it's hundreds more beds filled than January 4th of 2022. And that's the vaccine at work.
Yeah, I am equally fascinated by all of this, just like Rich mentions. But the one piece to this I also wonder about, and I will fully admit that the best I can say about it is that I wonder about it. And I don't have any great answers, is exactly how long COVID plays into any of that.
Yeah.
Because, we know that in especially the unvaccinated, that is sort of this other variable maybe that we hadn't thought about at the beginning. It may be reduced with vaccination, but sort of how that might play into this endemicity, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's something to think about is all I can say.
Yeah, it is. And it's going to be, that I think there's an important nuance here that what Rich is talking about with endemicity, and I think some of the resistance that you get, especially from people in public health, to the idea of endemicity, is that it, to people who don't know the field, it sounds almost like, oh, just let her rip, right? Which was being discussed early in the pandemic where, it doesn't kill that many people and they're old anyway, so just let it run its course. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying now that we've got the vaccine, we can protect almost everybody from the worst outcomes, or certainly get them less bad outcomes than they would have gotten without the vaccine. And at that point, we're not going to accomplish anything more. We've reached the end of what we can with modern science. We're not going to eradicate this virus. It will be here forever, or at least for generations to come. And let's go ahead and accept that and deal with the consequences of what that means. But one of the consequences of that, I think, is going to be that there will be people who did everything right, who limited their exposures, who got the vaccines, who got the boosters, who got infected anyway, and who got very sick, and who maybe ended up with long COVID, or who died, or who had other sequelae. And that's awful. That's where the limit of the science and the medicine are going to be. Yeah. And there will be some people who have those outcomes, and we don't know who they're going to be necessarily. I could have an outcome like that. I don't know. It's not likely, but unlikely things can happen.
Yeah. Eradication is not a choice.
Yeah.
Is sort of the way that I think about it. But that doesn't mean that we need to not try to figure out what's going on and do our best to get rid of some of those outcomes.
Yes.
Eradication's out because it's in all kinds of animals, but even if it weren't, let's say we didn't find it in any animal, I would still say it would be really tough to eradicate this because look at the vaccine levels. I'm not sure in many countries we would ever exceed that.
Look at viruses we've eradicated, all two of them. Right.
It's,
I mean, and those were not trivial efforts, and they went on for decades and decades. And one of them was in farm animals, where we can totally control everything. We can get them 100% vaccinated because they don't have a choice. And the other was smallpox, where, we were actually trying for hundreds of years to eradicate it.
No, yeah, but that effort had a lot going for it. Smallpox had a number of unique characteristics that made it eradicatable.
And conversely, look at polio, which we've been trying to eradicate for decades.
The other problem is we've just replaced the wild strains with vaccine strains.
It's the Fidel Castro of viruses, right? I mean, the WHO proudly eradicating polio for 50 years.
So speaking of Tony Fauci, he said the other day he's less concerned about the number of cases now. He's more concerned about the hospitalizations, right? Which is where we are. We have vaccines. That's the way it should be, right? Brianne, what do you have for us?
So I've always found the topic of correlates of protection to be really interesting. And I think that even among that, this year, I have probably talked about it and thought about it more than I have in any other year of my life. In some ways, that is in explaining to people that, when you say the immune response is waning, it turns out there's more than one kind of immune response. It's not just all one thing. But we talked about this a lot in general as we've talked about vaccines. And so this is really, very much related to what Vincent was talking about. But we had some specific papers that tried to identify a particular immune response that might be a correlate of protection with COVID. And that included papers on 791, 799, and 835, as well as I remember some of our conversations with Paul Pinash and Theodora Hatzianu that also came up. And so, just this general idea of what is a correlate of protection and how do we look for it and why do we care? And it turns out that actually came up in a bunch of other episodes for some of our other viruses as well. So we talked about influenza correlates of protection on 832. We talked about the RSV correlates of protection that Vincent mentioned in 841. And we talked about it for alpha viruses in 789, where we saw the importance of some antibodies that were non-neutralizing. And I feel like those have come up over and over again as well, with the idea that antibodies can do things other than just neutralize.
Yes.
And so I think that we'll be going forward getting more data on correlates of protection. You will notice that some of these happened sort of in the second half of the year, once we were able to vaccinate people and had the time to gather these data. It would be really nice to know that when we made the vaccine, but you don't have that option in most cases. And I think that we're going to also continue seeing a lot of information about correlates of protection going forward.
Brianne, the problem is that it's so easy to do a neutralization assay.
I know.
Right? And that's all people largely do. Now, they have always done some T-cell assays, but none of the other assays, which were in that RSV paper, are done. And, Florian Kramer once said, because an assay is useful, that makes it clinically useful. But what if it's not relevant?
Right.
Or less, who knows? So it seems to me that if you just keep measuring neutralizing antibodies, it's not going to give you the whole picture.
You're looking under the light for your keys. Yeah.
It's sort of like you're finding out that neutralizing antibodies in some cases correlate with the correlate. But you're not actually saying they are the correlate.
There was a term for that, right? There's the mechanistic correlate and then there's just the correlate,
like
right?
a statistical correlate or something like that.
So I would just like to jump in here because there may be some listeners who are like I was several years ago, who every time they heard the term correlative protection, they're not exactly sure what we're talking about. So I want to describe it in a different way, and you guys can rehash it and do it better. But to me, you look at a situation where someone, in this case, is protected from an infection, and then you look at the biology of the infection in any way that you can assay it. It could be assaying some aspect of the immune response or other thing, and you try to figure out what biological thing matches up consistently with a person or an animal or whatever being protected from that infection. So in this case, we're talking about primarily, it seems like people jump on neutralizing antibodies, that when someone is protected from an infection, then you can look at their neutralizing antibody levels, and whenever they're protected, their neutralizing antibody levels are high. That would match up with that being a correlate of protection.
Right. And one of the reasons why that's important is because after you do exactly what Kathy described, then in the future, you can do other studies and just measure neutralizing antibodies. And if the neutralizing antibodies are above a level that you have determined, you can say, aha, this person would be protected. They have enough antibodies.
Would most likely be protected, yes.
Yes. And so you're able to determine which immune response is the one that is related to that protection. And then you can look at people's immune responses and say, aha, if I gave them this vaccine or whatever thing I want to do, I have given them such and such immune response, and now they are most likely protected.
So it has a predictive.
Yeah. So there's a big part of it that's predictive as well.
Well, and the golden age of vaccinology, I think, was fed a lot by the knowing the correlates of protection. Oh, people who've had measles don't get it again. Let's figure out why that's the case. You figure out, oh, it's because they have antibodies against the virus. Let's see if this vaccine will induce antibodies against the virus. It does. Okay, let's try this vaccine. It's probably going to work.
Yep, exactly.
But, in other areas, we always rail against association versus causation. And here we have to be as stringent, right? But often we're not. Daniel Griffin, in his last clinical update last week, mentioned that this Baylor vaccine, right, which has gotten a lot of press, the way they're going to trial it is by measuring, and they have neutralizing antibodies. That's it, not protection against disease. They said this amount of neutralizing antibody, and that's it. We're going to say it works. And I'm just a little worried about that, and so was Daniel.
So you can comment on this if you like, Brianne, but one of the things that comes to my mind is that one of the reasons that there's so much focus on antibodies in general and neutralizing antibodies in particular is that of the things that you can try and correlate, they're the easiest to measure.
Yeah.
I think that that's part of it. I think that part of it is that spike was chosen as an antigen because it led to such a good neutralizing antibody response in MERS.
Yeah.
And so people said, oh, well, we're going to go with spike and neutralizing antibodies again. So I think those are certainly parts of it. And coming up with ways that we could more easily measure diversity of responses would be super cool. But I think that making sure people understand, is that correlative protection the neutralizing antibody? Is it some other antibody function? Is it the memory B cell, et cetera, is important for a lot of the questions that, come up regarding vaccines.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I get out of your conversation here and Kathy's comment is that correlate is a subtle and important word.
Yes,
okay, it doesn't mean that is the thing that is giving you protection. Period. Okay, it means it correlates with protection. Yeah. There may be other things going on as well.
Well, right. That's where mechanistic is telling you what is actually causing it. Yeah. Okay. So it's back to me again. Yep. So the other arc besides vaccines that I actually thought about and discussed, we didn't do many papers on it, is the fitness variant of concern arc, right? And it was at the end of 1220 that alpha emerged somewhere. It was first seen in the UK, but then it spread and it became predominant in many countries, and then it was followed by a number of other variants, such that by June, the WHO decided to use Greek letters to describe them.
By 12/20, you mean December of 2020.
By December of 2020, when Alpha was first
not an episode number.
Right.
Yeah, no. Just it predated 2021, but it got going big time in the beginning of 2021. And, in the U.S., a series of variants displaced other ones, and Delta displaced all of them, and now Omicron seems to be displacing. There's a wonderful chart over at covariance.org where you can look at a per country color graph of each of the variants, and you can see which one predominated at different times. And we did not. So Ron Fouché came on and he told us that this succession of variants is typical of influenza virus. In fact, if you look at the charts for influenza virus and SARS-CoV-2 that you could find at covariance.org, they look very similar. With time, there are different variants arising and displacing previous ones. And at some point, and I don't remember when it was, we decided to think of this in terms of fitness, and the variants have improved fitness, and why that would be isn't clear. And Fouché said for influenza, we know now that it is antigenic escape that gives them better fitness to these variants. And it doesn't take very much for one virus to become slightly more fit than another, and it will outcompete it. But what's going on with the SARS-CoV-2 variants, we don't know. And I remember asking Vineet Menachery early on in the year about the D614G variant, which arose in 2020 and early in the year, I think February or so. And he said, well, if you go in the lab and you do experiments in cell culture, you find it grows a little better, but is that really responsible for the enhanced fitness in people? He said, that's really hard to pin down. And I think that's where we are with a lot of these variants, that we can't pin down the reason for fitness. And we didn't talk about it because there aren't a lot of papers on it.
We did complain a fair amount about the general use of the term transmissibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's used differently for different situations, right? Like Tony Fauci just said, Omicron is extraordinarily transmissible. Well, and some people say it's almost as transmissible as measles, but that's the R0. That's not what Ron Fouché talks about when he talks about intrinsic transmissibility. So, there's a nomenclature issue, but.
Right. I'd like to jump in with another possible way of thinking about transmissibility or contagiousness, and that is if it appears that there are more people getting infected per unit time, then maybe that's what we should be talking about as it being more contagious, and there could be a lot of things underlying that. Yeah. But the easiest one to think about is more people are getting infected per unit time, then maybe it's more transmissible, again, with those underlying factors.
I mean, I think Jeff Shaman came on and talked about that, and he said it's very hard to dissociate, human factors. So R0 is composed of human factors and viral factors. And he said it's hard to dissociate and know the contribution of both. We assume that both are making a contribution, but we don't know what the relative proportion is. So this is all very difficult. And for someone came out last week and said the R0 of Omicron is like 12. I mean, first of all, that's wrong because you can't do R0 once the epidemic has begun. And it's also difficult to divide what's happening in people versus the virus. So I think we need experiments like Vineet was talking about in the lab where you start to get some information, but with the idea that it's always going to be difficult to make conclusions. And TWiV 836 OMG Omicron was a good one where we had a paper where they looked at, and the Omicron had nothing to do with the paper. The paper was looking at alpha, then beta and delta variants in cells explanted from the human respiratory tract in culture in the lab. And there was virtually no difference among the variants in terms of reproduction. So then you're left with, well, what explains what's happening in people? So that's why it's very hard to do that. Now some papers are starting to come out on Omicron, and we'll see. We'll start to cover some of those.
So I think our complaint as virologists is that transmissibility kind of implies some mechanistic
I think so.
Information that is just not present in the data. And you could imagine a virus being fitter because of immune escape, which has nothing to do with what we would call transmissibility, or because it causes milder disease. And therefore people are more likely to be out spreading it because they feel fine. Cytomegalovirus.
Viral load in the nose.
Yeah, viral load in the nose.
Absolutely.
It could be all kinds of things. Cytomegalovirus is extremely fit. Probably most of us have it, right? It's not particularly transmissible. It's not like somebody walks into a room and everybody's got CMV. But everybody gets it because it's asymptomatic in virtually everyone. And so nobody knows they have it and they go about their normal lives.
Right. I also think that if you're talking about transmissibility, and Vincent, you can correct me if I've misunderstood this, but that you think that we think that transmissibility, if we're measuring it in the virological sense, would be to have an uninfected animal in the vicinity of an infected animal, and if the virus could be transmitted from one to the other through the air, and if it was better. Okay, so we can do those kinds of experiments, or propose them at least, with animals, particularly ferrets in the case of these respiratory viruses. But to do that for people, we can't do that unless we went back to the 40s and 50s and experimented on people, which we're not going to do. And so we rely to a greater extent than on the epidemiological types of modeling, the kinds of things that Jeff Shaman talked about, where we take care of all the other factors that we can think of and eliminate them. And then if we're left with something about the virus seeming to be more transmissible, then, we're getting there, but it's still not the experimental kind of proof that.
Well, I think you can go back to some of the case tracing stuff from early in the pandemic. And if those types of analyses can be set up in the real world, now that we're doing all these, we're PCRing everybody who shows up with a cough, and you can look at who sat at which table at the wedding banquet, and you see that the people in closer proximity to the index case are in fact more susceptible, or who stood where in choir practice. And that was how we got the early insight on droplet transmission. If you can somehow do those comparisons now in similar settings for these variants and see if there's an actual change, so that, the index case was sitting at the table at the other end of the banquet hall and people got infected in a random pattern all around the hall, that would suggest a change in transmission to me. I mean, those are the kinds of data I would accept for that.
They would have to be very good,
Yes.
And often these case tracking they have error and uncertainty, and so
and I think the resources for that are going to go away very soon.
Yeah, I mean, I was just struck by Fouché, who said, and Kathy, you're right. That's how Fouché measures transmission. He puts ferrets in neighboring cages, right, and infects one, and sees if the other, and you can quantitate that. He said for flu, all of the fitness advantage of a variant can be explained by antigenic escape, and in fact, there are already a couple of preprints out last week, which conclude, and I don't know, how good that is, that Omicron is actually more fit because it's antigenically escaping, not transmissible, as they say. So we'll see how they go through peer review. But I think this is a difficult and nuanced topic that it's not suited to mass media conclusions about what's going on, basically.
Right. And I think there is a conflation in the mass media between transmissibility and contagiousness.
Yes.
And if we use contagiousness as a broader umbrella under which we can include fitness and with all those different kinds of components, then that helps.
It really, in a way, is too nuanced for the mass media to be able to deal with. I mean, you can't deal with this.
We're not equipped to have that conversation at that level.
We get a lot of emails where people say, I don't get this fitness business. What does it have to do with, so it's hard. Yeah, it's hard.
So to me, what's absolutely clear is that there have been a parade of variants that take over globally. And this particular one has been really swift, it seems to
Yes.
me.
Well, remember, people at this time of year, people's behaviors are changing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, and everything had pretty much reopened. And then the holidays came up, and so the timing of it was also perfect.
Beyond that, beyond the basic observation that there have been this parade of variants that seems to displace the previous one or take over. It's, as we've just discussed, it's complicated. Okay.
Yeah.
Not only that, but it's not necessarily the same. It's for each one. And I come across this all the time. Anytime, when something goes wrong in the laboratory, there's a great tendency to look for a single thing that is causing the problem.
Yeah.
When often it is more than one thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed.
And if your cells are not growing, today, it doesn't mean that it's the same reason that you figured out that they didn't grow last year.
Yes.
Okay. Could be a new one. Okay. So it's complicated.
Hate that problem.
So I just wanted to throw in an honorable mention here in my pick, TWiV 757, super shedders and super vaccines. So the super shedder part, we've learned early on that, 80% of transmissions are done by 20% of people from an epidemiological analysis. And this was a paper out of University of Colorado where they took all the PCR results that they've been doing on campus, and they found that, 90% of the RNA viral load was in 10% of the students, which matches perfectly with this super shedder. I mean, assuming that correlates with infectivity. But it's just it was a lovely study that, and I think Sarah Sawyer was on that paper as well, among others, that really nailed home this super shedder, super spreader idea. Okay, Kathy, you're next.
Okay, so I picked, as Vincent mentioned, we had a lot of guests, and what this year allowed us to do is have a lot of guests, what I would call off the beaten track. And so I'll just remind you of those, and if you haven't listened to all of them, you might want to think about going back. 723, we had Ginger Campbell, who's a physician who specializes in palliative care. It's not something you would ordinarily think of having on a This Week in Virology podcast, but I thought it was a particularly interesting one and brought up a lot of things that maybe people hadn't thought about before. Shortly after that, we had Janet Iwasa, who does molecular animations that are just fantastic. And hearing her talk about it and the philosophy and then present them was really fascinating. So that was, I don't know that I have the number here for
You don't.
Janet
I can
Iwasa's.
find it for you.
Okay, thanks. And then we had a couple of different citizen science ones. 732 with Forrest Rower and Marissa Rojas from San Diego State University, and they had citizens going out around San Diego sampling various things and sending them in the samples, and how they got all of that to work, I thought was really fascinating. And more recently, then there was the Magic Virus Bus 838. I was not on that episode, but that was interviewing another set of students going out and collecting samples that I thought was really great.
Was there a wastewater episode too?
I had that one listed. I'm not sure how much that used people going out, but if you want to think about it indirectly, everybody
people going.
shedding water, shedding into the wastewater, then you're getting all the citizens' data. And someone just sent me a picture of the wastewater in Boston and a curve with since the timing of since Omicron has come into play, and that's measuring RNA in the wastewater. So it's not necessarily measuring infectious virus, but it's probably a pretty good idea.
I've seen that figure, and it is is jaw dropping.
Scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's plotted on one graph, and you see these little bumps that are the first two waves in Massachusetts, and then you see this spike going up to the top of the graph. That's the latest. Yeah.
So those are the citizen science ones. And Rich has now put in, it was episode 726 with Janet Iwasa from University of Utah. Another one that we had, Vincent, I still consider it a coup that we got Laurie Garrett on, who's a prize-winning writer, but has been understanding and investigating public health in the United States for years. And she just came on with a lot of
that
really
was a great
interesting
episode.
perspectives. And then one of the ones that's my favorite was 745, Gorilla COVID with Nadine Lambersky, in part because Nadine had been my first undergraduate dishwasher when I was at the University of Georgia, starting out as an assistant professor. But Nadine has made it big as a veterinarian, and she talked all about the outbreak among gorillas at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. And I just thought that one was really fun. So we got to have a lot of different sorts of people as our guests.
Yeah.
Alan.
So my other arc is the good, bad, and ugly public health responses in the second year of the pandemic. And we talked, in 2020 a lot about how difficult the response was and everything going on then. 2021, beginning of the year, we had the CDC just, being relieved of its biggest problem, which was the Trump administration had gutted it and abused it for the preceding 4 years, and they were essentially in a shambles. I mean, that's why we hadn't heard much from the CDC in 2020 on this, and why Tony Fauci ended up being the spokesperson for the pandemic. He did a great job, but the director of NIAID is not supposed to be the person on TV telling the nation about the virus. That's supposed to be the head of the CDC and the Surgeon General doing that, but those people were not participating. CDC finally got competent management in the beginning of 2021, but and I think overall Rochelle Walensky is doing the best possible job for a CDC director under the circumstances. But the circumstances are that she walked into a pile of rubble and in the middle of a pandemic, and she's I do not want her job. It's just a really difficult situation. The outcome of that is still ongoing. And of course, there's been long-term damage to the CDC's credibility among not only the general public, but also among many in the public health sector. So against that's been unfolding through the course of 2021. It's going to continue to unfold in 2022. We all just poked at them on Twitter recently about the CDC now recommends, all sorts of crazy things because they shortened the quarantine time to a completely unjustifiable 5 days, and basically said, you don't even have to you don't even have to get a negative test to end your self-isolation. That was done as a desperate effort to not have the world fall apart, basically. I mean, they're in a horrible position. And I made fun of them too, because, hey, why not? I said something like the CDC now recommends drinking alone. But they got into this position because of what had happened before, and now they're trying to work their way out of it. They are, as I say, I really think they are now doing their best, but their best is just way behind the curve. And we've got simultaneously all these fragmented state responses, which we saw in 2020, carried over into 2021. Some states, you have competent management in the governor's mansion, and they're getting as much of the population vaccinated as possible, and they implemented various mandates to try and limit spread, and now they're trying to evolve as the pandemic goes on. And then other states, you have people who are on the conspiracy theory bandwagon who are, not having any of that. And you see the differences in infection rate as a result. And this is an arc that we've talked about, throughout the year. And unfortunately, I think we're going to be talking about it into 2022. And then internationally, the vaccine shortages we talked about, but also the idiotic travel bans that the U.S. and other countries have put in place and then rescinded and then put in place and then rescinded. And most recently with Omicron, we put a travel ban in place that hindered all kinds of things for South Africa when in fact they had done exactly what we want everybody to be doing and tracking these things and reporting them. And then they got punished for it by this ruinous travel ban, which was of course silly because we should have already known that Omicron was already here. So we're closing the barn door. So that's my rundown of what we talked about in terms of the public health responses. And as I say, this will continue playing out in 2022, hopefully with some steady improvement.
So we are pretty U.S. centric, but I'm sure other countries' public health agencies have had missteps as well.
Well, I mean, we've talked a little bit about Sweden.
Yes.
I think certainly for my own part, and I think I'm speaking for all of us when I say we're a little bit reluctant to criticize other countries' administrations because you don't want to go into somebody else's house and tell them what color to paint the walls. Yeah, a lot of what the U.S. has screwed up has happened in other places too.
Two quotes come to mind as you talk about this. The first was from my friend and public health expert, Bob Chen, who was not on the show, but I interact with him otherwise, who said that, quite seriously, that by its very nature, public health is a mixture of science and politics. That's the name of the game. And then there was Peter Daszak who said, when you mix science and politics, you get politics.
Yes.
Great. Rich, what do you have?
Okay, so unfortunately, I think the story would not be complete if we didn't mention the lab leak nonsense arc, okay? Because this did come up more than once, sometimes flared up really big, and I think we dealt with it and dealt with it well. The two episodes, we dealt with it in several episodes, but the two episodes that I think are the most important are the two with Robert Gary, 762 and 774. Whenever I talk to somebody about, I just had this conversation with somebody the other day, a stranger, about, the pandemic, was revealed that I had some knowledge of this. And in the course of the conversation said, what about the lab leak thing? It comes up. It seems to be resting recently,
knocking on wood,
which is good, knocking on wood. But just to summarize, there is no evidence that this thing came from a laboratory. And there is every reason to believe, both historically and with what we know about the virus now, that it, like essentially all other situations like this, is a spillover from an animal reservoir. And if you want the details, it's in episodes 762 and 774.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people out there who still
of course,
buy that,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But one of the things that seems to happen, and I think this happened the last time, is that I forget the author, but somebody wrote a big, long expose, somebody with some seeming credibility. And I don't think it was in the Atlantic. It might.
Yes, there was. Okay, so I am
bitterly
disappointed in Nicholson Baker.
There you go.
Who I've got to say, he was one of my favorite novelists. He's a brilliant writer of these in-depth novels that are in many ways wonderful, but I'm not recommending that anybody go out and buy his books. Maybe check them out from the library, because I think he did a tremendous amount of damage with this well-written but completely misinformed article. Yeah.
Well, I went on to Lex Friedman podcast, and we talked about how much nonsense this is. And then a couple of weeks ago, he gets some crackpot on who pushes it again, And it's like, didn't you listen to anything? So it's fodder for clicks. People just like it because people are interested in it. And you publish an episode on it, you get a lot of interest, and if you counter it, you don't get anything. So
no, you get
less.
Yes, you do
feedback.
get negative feedback.
That's true. It's
New
true.
York Magazine.
That's what. Okay.
Yeah, New York Magazine, Intelligencer. There was another one as well, I think. But at any rate.
But there wasn't.
I'm thinking of the Nicholas Wade.
There you go.
Oh, Nicholas Wade. That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you said Nicholson Baker, I thought,
Yeah,
is that right?
There were two.
But
There were
anyway,
two.
Yeah.
Where was the Nicholas Wade one?
Nicholas Wade's an actual science journalist who should really know better.
Let's see. I'm clicking on the link.
Here it is. Where is it?
Wasn't it that
Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists.
Yes.
Bulletin of the
Yes.
Atomic Scientists? Yes.
Yes.
And
And he's the
that
one-
really stirred things up. And that article was extraordinarily annoying.
Yeah.
Well, he also interviewed David Baltimore, who said the Fuhrer and cleavage site was a smoking
Right.
gun and then he later said, no, I shouldn't have said that. But the guy
It's
didn't.
done.
Damage
It's
was
done.
done.
Yeah.
It's done.
At any rate, go listen to those two episodes if you have any remaining questions. 762,
And I also think
774.
our Michael Warraby analysis, the science opinion paper that we talked about that. I think that was good also to look at the very early days of the outbreak in Wuhan. All right, finally, Brianne, what do you have for us?
So I have something that is sort of the opposite of what Rich was just talking about. But it's the idea of the importance of One Health, or thinking about viruses, not just in the human population, but also in other organisms, particularly viruses in wildlife. This, comes up when we talk to Nadine Limbersky, of course, with SARS-CoV-2 and gorillas. But we talked about it very generally in terms of hosts and vectors of zoonotic disease in 799. We talked about bat coronaviruses when we looked. When people looked at sampling of wild bats in 722 and 771 and 809, coronaviruses in rodents in 798, coronaviruses in pigs and dogs in 759, deer, 791 and 847, and other viruses in bats in 750 and in 821. The influenza B virus in the Wuhan spiny eel in 824, and viruses in a pretty diverse array of organisms with Maya Breitbart on 804. And so I think all of those things sort of show the importance of looking at viruses in their natural host in the wild, and how much you can find by doing those types of studies. I think I've liked reading studies like this since I was an undergrad or grad student. I don't think I'd like to do them, but I am so glad that people do and that they write them so that I can read about them.
Every time I read a wildlife biology study, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I'm so glad I didn't do this.
Yep, exactly.
That's
That's
really
a
a
good-
nice arc to
That is good.
wind up
Yeah.
the
Great.
discussion with Brianne, because that's really where all this, centers on.
I think it's a great arc, and looking at all the episodes, we do a lot of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're all very interested in wildlife sampling and the implications, right?
I think so too. And I think that it's also really cool that it seems like whenever people do something like this, they find new stuff, and it tells
Yeah.
us how much there is out there to be found.
And this emphasizes that this is where the viruses are,
Yes.
folks. Here they are.
It's the
and every
Willie
time
Sutton approach. Yeah.
we find a new one, and they're not in the lab, they're in the nature. It's great. All right. So a few more things to wrap up before we give you some picks. Favorite episode titles. I always think it's fun. Of course, most of them are made by Alan, but now and then Dixon or someone else will get a title in. And so my favorite for the year, it's tough because there are a lot of good ones. My favorite was Grand Theft Kinesin, the story of herpes virus packaging a motor protein from the cell to help it motor into the nucleus. And this is a great combination of a video game and the science. I loved it. This was Alan's, of course. What about you, Kathy?
Well, I couldn't just pick one, so I picked two. I'm not the only one who did that. TWiV 750 to air is viral. And so that's the one where we talked about copyback defective viral genomes modulating clinical outcome of respiratory syncytial virus infection. And then 802, which I think was probably a listener favorite as well, another epitope with Shane Crotty.
So the epitope came from the grandson of a listener.
That's right.
Yes.
She emailed it. That was just
what epitope
brilliant.
are
What
we on?
epitope are you listening to? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. How about you, Alan?
I had to scroll through the past episodes, and it was I mentioned striking how many there are. But I ended up picking a Mad Virologist's Tea Party, which I think encompassed a lot of things in the show in many of our arcs. But this particular episode we talked about, that was the first discussion we had, I think, of the white-tailed deer with SARS-CoV-2, and then also the spike-specific T cells were a discussion, which is tying into another arc that we've had on the show. But I thought that was a fun title.
Yeah. We had one with Sete that was Rhapsody in T,
Yes.
I think, right? Which was a riff of Rhapsody in B or something. Or
Well, we had
We had a concerto in B.
concerto in B years ago.
Yep. How about you, Rich?
My all-time favorite is episode 842, The Clot Thickens, which to me is a deep pun. And you weren't on that episode. Oh, first of all, that episode was about the mechanism, the proposed mechanism for the adverse effect of the adenovirus vectored vaccines causing a clotting disorder, a rare clotting disorder. And as I recall, you weren't on that episode.
I was not on that
Neither
episode.
was I. Did you do that title?
I did do that title. I logged
You
in.
snuck in there.
Yes,
Okay.
I logged in and I looked at what the episode was about, and I popped that in there.
Okay, because if there's such a thing as a deep pun, that's it.
That's very good. A lot of people like that also outside of us, apparently. And finally, Brianne, what's yours?
So I also had two because I couldn't choose. One of them is 824. Part of the reason why this is a great title is that this episode was released on Halloween. And so this is immunogoblins in the nose and lungs. And this was a discussion of the immune responses in non-human primates that were given the Moderna vaccine 1 year after vaccination, and looking at those immune responses, particularly those in the nose and lungs, as well as the Wuhan spiny eel. And I also really liked episode 796's title. On that episode, we had Paul and Theodora, Paul Binash and Theodora Hatianu, who came to talk about their polymutant spike, the version of the SARS-CoV-2 spike where they tried to make mutations in all of the epitopes, and it was called the very hungry spike. Of course, very, VARY, because of all the variations. And so I also really like that one.
And the very hungry caterpillar.
Yes.
Right. So I have to say that until I saw you pick these titles, I had not seen either one of them written out. And because when I'm listening, oftentimes it just goes to the next TWiV and I'm just listening. And so I would not have picked up on immunogoblins versus immunoglobulins. And of course, I wouldn't have picked up on the spelling of very, VARY.
Yeah.
So some of them you have to see to get.
Yeah. Anyway, we will continue to have cool titles, I hope, for this year, including this one. A few other thanks. I want to thank Jolene Ramsey, who does all the timestamps on the episodes. If you go to the website, you can find each of the references, papers, and links with a timestamp, roughly when we've talked about it. And that's for all the TWiVs and also some of the other podcasts. And so, Jolene, we thank you very much for doing that. They're often done very quickly, and it's just amazing.
Yeah, fast turnaround, and really important for us when I go back and look for things and when in the show did we talk about that, and I can just click on the
I use them all the
based
time.
on the timestamp.
Yep.
Yeah.
And of course, Jolene's mother made this phage pillow that's in my and Alan's background there.
We stand Jolene here with the
Yes. I also want to thank Jolene for keeping the TWiVerse page together, microbe.tv/TWiVerse. Whenever someone sends in a poem or a haiku or some other verse, she puts it there. So you can find them all there. And there were some this year, not as many as the previous year when we had a contest. But there were some. People are still inspired. So thanks. You can send in your verse if you'd like. It gets put there. And you're very clever.
That contest was more than a year ago.
It was. So, yes, because when I looked at last year's year in review, we were reviewing the TWiVerse. Yeah, so that was 2020,
2020
right?
and 2021 are a syncytium.
There's syncytium. Yes. That's right. Also, in addition to our help this year, David Ramada, who joined, I don't know, halfway through the year. I can't remember. He was listening to a live stream and he heard me say, I need some help with video editing. And so it turns out he's on Staten Island, which isn't far from here. And he's a very good video editor.
It's almost like part of the same city.
Yes, it's New York City. And
Could be a syncytium.
It is reluctantly part of New York City, I think, but yeah.
And he's been in the incubator a few times. He will be here to help out whenever I have people here, I get him to come and help with the
Do you know what part of Staten Island is he on?
I don't know that.
Okay. I lived right in St. George for a few years next to the ferry terminal.
Anyway, he does the video edits on the Daniel's TWiV, and I hope to. So thank you for that, David. And I do pay David for that because he does this as a living. So I want to thank you anyway because it's a great job. And I give him the files on Thursday about 6 p.m. when I finish. I put them in the Dropbox here, and then I need them by Friday evening because that's when I actually upload the video for release on Saturday at midnight. And he does. He always does that. And sometimes I have a change at the last minute, and he'll say, all right, I'm walking around Manhattan. Let me get home, and I'll do it in about an hour. So thank you very much, and I hope to have him help me out more in the future as well.
Great.
YouTube has become a big part of Microbe TV also. This year we passed 100,000 subscribers. We're currently at 105,000, so it continues to go up at a nice clip. And I just remember the time when we were at 12,000 a couple of years ago, and I needed to reach 25,000 to apply for a Google grant of some kind, and we couldn't do it.
Couldn't get there.
Tried.
All it took was a pandemic.
Pandemic, boom. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we were just short of 25. And this has been all since then. So I have put more effort into that. I've, tried to make nicer video. I want to improve the production value of the video even more going forward. But you may notice that at least here on TWiV, the video is much better because we record it locally. And I try to play with the presentation a little to mix it up. But we're going to keep working on that, and I'm going to have David help with that as well. And I want to thank everyone who contributed through Patreon, PayPal. I smelled it. PayPal. It's PayPal. And checks. I get some checks in the mail. It's okay as well. And also to Daniel's Parasites Without Borders. He's now done 2 fundraisers where he's raised a lot of money both times. Last year, he couldn't give it to us, otherwise we'd have to pay tax on it. But now we're a 501c3, so we can get all of that money and use it for running this company. So I want to thank him for doing that. And then those of you who have purchased through Amazon, thanks for that as well. We really need it to keep the lights on, as I said last time. Anything else, folks, that anyone wants to bring up before we move on to some picks? All right, time for some picks of the week. Brianne, what do you have for us today?
So I have a movie that is on Netflix called Don't Look Up. I know it has been somewhat polarizing with different people, but I watched it. I really enjoyed it. And I also really enjoyed the non-science folks who I watched with and their reactions to it. So basically in this movie, there is a comet headed towards the Earth that is an extinction level comet. And you are seeing this story of the scientists that are discovering this and their efforts to try to tell people about this and how people respond. And so you get to see some government responses and responses by the tech industry and people who do and don't believe them, and conspiracy theories and how the scientists are.
Any similarity to actual events is purely intentional. Yes.
Yeah, you can easily read it as thinking about the pandemic or thinking about climate change or a lot of other ways. And there are a lot of really great actors. You can't miss the similarities to current events. But there are also many times where we talk about some of the science and politics things or some ways that science is dealt with by the media and things like that are just displayed so well in this movie. And again, I was also just really excited at how much the non-scientists I was with got it from watching this movie.
So, Brienne, this guy with the hat, is that supposed to be the president?
No, the president is played by Meryl Streep.
Oh, okay.
And they have said in articles that she was meant to be a combination of Donald Trump and Sarah Palin.
So she's against doing anything about this comet, I guess, right?
Kind of.
Okay. Wow, what a cast, man. That's cool. Beautiful photo. Wow, really well done. I haven't seen that. Cool. Kathy, what do you have for us?
Well, I have something that I've been wanting to pick for a while, but I had to do the research, and I picked it despite the research results. This is spaceweather.com, and I finally figured out the way to look for it, and I just Googled for spaceweather.com and TWiV. I first tried space weather in TWiV, and I found a bunch of other things, and then I searched for this link. And TWiV. It was previously picked by Alan.
Space weather is an ongoing interest of mine. That's why that comes up, yes.
Picked by Alan, January 3rd, 2010 in TWiV 64. But I thought it was worth a repick. And one of the things that I had noticed when whoever sent it to me sent it was that kind of in the top right corner, there's archives. So you can go back to different times and find the news. And, for instance, the headlines, almost no chance of flares today, and an ecstatic solar eclipse, and inferior conjunction of Venus, and just lots and lots of things that, Mr. Spock in the stratosphere. So that's a bobblehead of Mr. Spock with incredible lighting and so forth, making you want to get it, I suppose. So, you can have it for $170. Wow.
So that was, TWiV 64 was our first TWiV for 2010. We did our year, 10 virology stories of 2009. It was me, Alan, and Rich. And listen, we just had 10 stories. Pandemic influenza, because previously that was the pandemic year. XMRV and chronic fatigue syndrome. AIDS vaccine success in quotes, colony collapse disorder, AIDS-like disease in chimps, diverse viral community in an Antarctic lake, polyomavirus, seroepidemiology in humans. These are all individual episodes for the most part. Poxvirus threatens UK red squirrels, polio spreads from Nigeria, and how mosquitoes survive dengue virus infection.
Simpler times.
Just
Well, that was a
simpler
great year.
times, yes.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah, hopefully we get back to where we do 10 stories.
Space weather is a great thing to be following now because solar cycle 25 is ramping up. And it looks like a good one.
Cool. Rich, what do you have for us?
You guys are going to have to tell me if this has been picked before. This is an astronomy picture of the day video from some time ago. It's a video of the green flash. Okay. And I
Not
also
a superhero.
I also linked to the wiki site describing a green flash. This is the flash of green that happens at the very end of a sunset under appropriate conditions, if you can see it.
Yes.
And I've been hearing about this all my life. I don't think I've watched numerous sunsets. I don't think I've ever actually seen it myself in a convincing fashion, to the point where I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know if it was a real thing. Here's a video. It's a real thing, and this will show you what to look for. And
Cool.
It's pretty remarkable.
Neat.
Wow. That's neat. No, it's not been picked.
Okay.
Got it. Alan, what do you have for us?
I have an article from Science Line. I think I picked. I know I must have picked this site a while ago. This is it's an online science news site put together by the students in NYU's Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program, which is a graduate program that I used to teach in their journalism school. This is just an article I found really cool about violins made from wood that's been deliberately inoculated with and incubated with fungi. And the article explains why somebody would do this. It turns out you can make a really nice violin this way because the fungus digests and erodes away the wood in a way that lightens it. And makes it more similar to the wood that the violins of a few centuries ago were made from by people like Stradivari. So one of the things, now Stradivari was a brilliant violin maker and had a lot of techniques that he perfected, and so a lot of the credit goes to him for his craftsmanship. But a significant amount of credit also goes to the wood that he used, and the article explains what was special about that wood and why it's so difficult to get wood like it now, because the climate has changed. And there was a unique set of circumstances that caused a very irregular growth pattern in the wood used for violin making at his time, and led to him having superior materials to anything that's available today. But by inoculating wood with fungi, you can recover some of those effects. And it's a whole article talking about the science behind that, and just a really, really good read. And the author is Deborah Balthazar, who's in the SHRP program at NYU, I guess.
Cool.
Thank you for picking this out, Alan, because this is awesome.
This is really cool.
It's a fun read, yeah.
Who would have known? Who would have thought? That's just great. Yeah, Deborah says down below, in her spare time, she enjoys sleeping
and some other activities.
Yeah. That's great. All right, so when our older son visits for the holiday, he always says, you gotta watch this. And he shows us some YouTube channel, which is always amazing. And so he showed us this one last week called This Old Tony, right? Now, this guy does videos on machining and metalworking, and he makes stuff. Mm-hmm. He has a machine. He'll take a block of stainless steel, and you can program the machine to like drill a pattern into it. And he has a close up, and all the metal shavings are coming off, and then you have this perfectly machined thing, and it's just mesmerizing. And you never see his face; it's just his hands. He'll be next to a machine, and he talks with his hands, so you don't really need to see his. It's a cool way of teaching, actually, because you're going to learn stuff. And I found it absolutely mesmerizing. I don't know anything about machining. There are apparently machines that you can program to do this, right?
CNC mills, yeah.
If he needs a screw, he'll make it himself out of a little piece of metal. Once he was having trouble getting some part out of another machine, so he designed a screw to put it in, and then he could screw into it and pull the whole thing. And you know how to make a screw? You put a piece of metal in this rotating thing, and then the computer directs a cutter, and it just goes down, and you watch the thread being cut in the show. So that's what these videos are all about. It's amazing. The guy has over 1 million subscribers.
He's got
doing
a great
something
sense of
right.
humor too.
He's got a great sense of humor. In fact, the clip I put in here, there's a segment, and I've put the time right at the right segment where he made a knife. His last video is he made a knife. And these guys are makers. They send it to each other. They send each other gifts, right? They'll pick a maker on YouTube and say, I'm going to send them this, and they get stuff back and forth. And so he made a knife, and he was demonstrating how sharp it was in this little clip. And it's really
pretty cool.
It's pretty funny.
This Old Tony, of course, just a take on This Old House.
Yes.
But I just amazed. I didn't know you could do any of this stuff. It's amazing what he bought this old, and it is a more recent video I looked at. He bought this old machine. It was originally made in Germany. It's quite old, which is a machiner. And it's got a platform that can go X, Y, Z, right? So you can probe it. You can program it to move, and it cuts metal. You put metal on it, and then you cut it. And it made noise in the Z direction. So he wanted to replace the servo, and he goes through 2 videos telling you we did that. But it's so well done. He really explains how it works. So anyway, there you go.
Cool.
And it's sciencey. It's clearly sciencey.
Yeah, it's an engineering thing.
Anyway, Paul, we have 2 listener picks. Paul writes, hi, gang. I really think you'll enjoy this. The tech is fascinating. And Columbia University's own is mentioned in the article. Quote, the fact that it can be applied at this level of quality is an impressive thing, says Mohammed Ikurash, a system biologist at Columbia, who has developed his own software for predicting protein structure. He also points out that having structures for most of the proteins in an organism will make it possible to study how these proteins work as a system, not just in isolation. That's what I think is most exciting, he says. I think your viewers would appreciate a dive into the utility of these data. Perhaps Mr. Al-Quresh would contribute to a TWiV. This tech will predict the geometry of a given collection of nucleic acids. I'm contemplating whether it is possible to define a geometry and have the system specify the assembly of bases that would take that form. It's likely that the solution would not be unique. Happy New Year, TWiV crew. And he sends a link. This is the alpha folding program, which we all know about.
When he says, hi, gang, it's another visual, HIGH, gang.
Is that a compliment?
I think so. I don't know. Yeah, I think
probably.
so.
Anyway, we'll put the link to that in. Thank you, Paul. And Grant writes, greetings, TWiV hosts. As an enlightened fan of TWiV and a retired clinical medical technologist, I have a listener's pick suggestion. The pick is a relatively short explanation of the SARS-CoV-2 life cycle and the importance of the viral production of protease that enzymatically cuts 2 large polypeptides into small proteins that are enzymes involved in replicating the virus. Pfizer's new antiviral inactivates, he says the proteases, but it's one of the 2 proteases. And this is a Pfizer animation here that he links to, which is quite nice. All right, that'll do it for TWiV number 849. So what did we do? We did 146 episodes last year. So if we did 140, that would bring us close to 1,000 this year. But we're not going to make 1,000, right? In 2022.
146 last year, right?
Yeah, so we'll make 1,000 in 2023. And that, of course, is when you all come to the incubator in person. And hopefully we'll be able to do that in 2023.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping that the pandemic backs off enough so that we don't do another 150 episodes this year.
Yes.
Okay.
I will take the train either way.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm there.
Brianna's close.
Yeah.
You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV, TWiV. Send your questions and comments to twiv@microbe.tv. And throughout the rest of January, Parasites Without Borders is still running its fundraiser. You donate to them, go to parasiteswithoutborders.com, and Daniel Griffin will match your contribution and give it back to us, Microbe TV. And, he has said we'll match up to $40,000, but I think he will probably match more, so don't stop. And it's a 501c3, of course. Your donations are federal U.S. tax deductible. And, of course, you can always go to microbe.tv/contribute and give to us, and it will still be tax deductible. And don't forget, for all of 2021, your contributions are tax deductible. Okie dokie. Let's see. In the order in which they joined TWiV, Alan Dove is at alandove.com. He is Alan Dove on Twitter. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Rich Condit is an emeritus professor, University of Florida, Gainesville. He's currently in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough. Always a good time. Get vaccinated.
Kathy Spindler's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks. This is a lot of fun.
And Brianne Barker's at Drew University, BioProf Barker on Twitter. Thanks, Brianne.
Thanks. It was great to be here. And thanks, everybody, for all the hard work you put into this.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, and Ronald Jenkins for the music. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon. Another TWiV is viral.